So in the Cain and Abel story, Cain makes second-rate sacrifices, right? So he doesn't bring his best to the table. And in consequence, he fails. This is one of these situations where the meaning of the pattern of human life is being acted out by people who can't propositionalize it yet, who can't conceptualize it explicitly. So they're acting it out. And so human beings discovered at some point that they could sacrifice the present for the future and themselves for the community, and that actually worked better as a medium to long-term strategy. So that's why the community is based on sacrifice. And you made reference to that with regard to the impulse that entered your imagination when you were taking your son to the hospital, that realization that there's something more important, well, than you, even in total in a way, but certainly than what you might merely want at the moment, right? And so Cain, who's kind of luciferian and he thinks he can get away with his tricks, he doesn't bring his best to the table and he fails. And so he could notice that and rectify his fault and confess and atone and fly right and succeed. That's on the table. But instead, he becomes bitter and he shakes his fist at God. And so his presumption fundamentally is that the fact of his failure is emblematic of the dysfunction of the world. It's not him, even though he's not bringing his best to the table. It's the structure of reality itself. So it's unbelievably arrogant, right? So that's the Luciferian element. Unbelievably intellectually arrogant.
And
it's not me.
What wouldn't you do to the world if you believe that? What wouldn't you do?
Yeah, you'd burn it to the ground. Well, that's basically what happens in the story as it unfolds. So he shakes his fist at God, and then he has a conversation with God. And God says, he says, you think that you're suffering because you're not doing well, and that's a consequence of your misery. First of all, if you did well, you would be accepted. So that's a very interesting claim. The idea is that if you gave it everything you had, it would work. And you can imagine that that's a kind of faith, right? That you have to have faith to do that. Because there's no evidence to begin with that if you brought your best to the table, it would work. And, maybe you've had experiences where people betrayed you and so forth that made you doubtful, or you betrayed yourself. So it is emblematic of faith to bring your best to the table. God's rejoinder to Cain is that if you brought your best to the table, you would succeed. Now, you can imagine people being skeptical about that, but I think the right response to the skeptics is, have you brought your best to the table?
What's the other option?
That's what's explored. Okay,
right.
So, and then God says something even stranger to Cain. He says something like, you're also blaming your suffering on your failure, but that's not exactly right. And this is very interesting causally, because we like to think that, people who go crooked, let's say, do that because they've been hurt, because terrible things have happened to them. And there's an intervening variable theory in this account between Cain and Abel. So what God tells Cain is that there were many ways that he could have reacted to the fact of his own failure. And he picked one. And the one he picked was rife with a terrible temptation. He says, sin crouches at your door like a sexually aroused predatory animal, and you let it in to have its way with you. And so the idea there is that Cain is turning to vengeful bitterness in consequence of his failure when that wasn't the only option. So he's inviting the spirit of vengeful bitterness to possess him, and then he's actually to have its way with him. And he's actually entering into a creative union with that, and that's the cause of his misery. And that's the end of the discussion. And that enrages Cain, and that's when he invites Abel to go work with him. So it's a false invitation. And then he kills him. And then Cain's children become more and more murderous, and his grandchildren make weapons of war. And the next story is the flood, or the Tower of Babel. right? So it's a complete story of human degeneration. And it's a covenantal account too, because Cain violates the covenant with God by not bringing everything he has to bear on the situation. And think, well, what's the counter proposition to that? Is that the counter proposition is that you can succeed by hedging your bets. Well, who would believe that? Like when you lay it out bluntly,
Right, you
that,
might just get away with it, something
well,
like
that's
Right.
the hope.
Right.
Well, but then underneath that, there's obviously the idea that you're smart enough to pull the wool over what? Your eyes,
God's
everyone else's,
eyes.
God's eyes,
Yeah.
everyone's eyes. That's who you are. Eh? Or worse, that's the spirit that you've invited to possess you. Right. And then when it reveals itself completely, it turns out to be fratricidal and then genocidal.
That's probably how most of us operate on a day-to-day basis, right? I mean, the most people probably operate on some version of pulling the wool over their eyes, right? Right?
Yeah, well,
Like,
that's certainly. The
I'm not talking
psychoanalytic
about
claim.
the most exceptional people. You know,
Yeah.
I'm not talking about like that.
Well, that's the
level.
question of conscience for everyone.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, well, if things aren't going your way, just whose fault is that? Well, the other thing you might want to realize too is that if you're lucky, it's your fault, because you can do something about that. If it's the state of the world, let's say, or if it's God's distaste for you at some fundamental level, let's say, or the impossibility of existence in general, then you're really in hell. But if it's you, well, then you could possibly do something about it.